Hi, I am Chitra.
I am Madhavi.
I'm Jyothi.
I'm Suchitra.
Together, we are your hosts.
On the Aedge podcast.
We bring you stories and experiences
From our experiments around learning, marketing, and design.
These are stories of people, technology,
And people interacting through technology.
of what we see, create,
And recommend.
Repeat a lie often enough and it becomes the truth, is a law of propaganda commonly heard. Psychologists call this the illusion of truth effect. Repetition has a power to make things sound more true even when we know differently. In this episode, we talk about how this phenomenon plays out in our daily lives as well as in the field of UX, and how do we be aware of the illusory truth effect. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Aedge podcast. This is the second episode in our UX and cognitive biases series, Rarely Rational. I am Jyothi, and today joining me in exploring people's decision making abilities is Chitra, my co host. Hi, Chitra.
Hey, hi, Jyothi. By the way, Rarely Rational is such an apt title for this series. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Great. Yeah, I've had a lot of fun figuring out cognitive biases and thinking why we think or why how we make decisions the way we make. And that's why I thought, during my research for these episodes, we are rarely rational.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I think you can say that again.
Right. So I thought this was a good title for our series. Okay. So let me start with a small game, Chitra.
Okay, this is exciting. I wonder how a game is going to appear to listeners on a podcast, but lead the way,
Yeah,
Jyoti.
right. Yeah. So I will give you three words, and you need to come up with something that connects those three words quickly. Like, don't take too much time to think, something that probably just bounces off the top of your head. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Here goes: elephant, house, snow. Something that connects these three words, or a word that you can associate.
White.
Ah, that's great. Yeah, right?
Okay.
White elephant, a white house, and Snow White.
Yeah,
Shall I ask another set of words like that?
sure. This is getting interesting.
Black, bulletin, and chalk.
Board. I didn't even think there. I just said black, and the first thing that came to my mind was blackboard.
Oh, yeah, that was
And I
quick.
think it fits.
That was quicker than the first one, right? So, how do you think this association happened, or what was your thought process behind this?
Actually, for the second one, there was no thought process. I was just all, excited to get into this game, and I said board. But I think this is a good example. They say that thinking is faster than lightning. So I guess it just happened that way. There was this whole feeling of wow. It felt so good to have.
Like a small win that you got,
Yeah,
right
yeah.
in the game.
Exactly. And made me feel really good that I knew about it. But hey, Jyoti, I have a question for you now.
Okay.
Okay. So, what's your favorite song?
Levitating by Dua Lipa. That's
Have
like
you been-
my current favorite song.
So, how many times would you say you've listened to it?
Oh, 1,000 times. I mean, it's there on my almost every day.
So, it must be like this very friendly earworm that's with you all the time.
Yeah, it does feel like that. I mean,
Hmm.
it's not really on the top of the charts currently, but somehow over the last few days that came up in my playlist, and I've been listening to it over and over.
Yeah, you just can't seem to let go, which also leads me to think about this little thing that I read recently, and it said
Mhm.
that the more people listen to a song, it's likely to feature on the top of their playlists. And I'm even wondering if that's fair to all, song creators, writers, and producers. And
Yeah.
if you look at all the awards uh, that are given out internationally for the best songs, At the end of the day, it's the most listened to song, right? I mean, on the one sense, you can get the idea that yes, that's the most popular one, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the others are bad.
Yeah, for some reason, this particular song, the one which won the award, was her listened to a lot more times, right?
Yeah. So you were asking about, the association that was happening in the first place. It literally, for me, it came out of nowhere. But I'm sure that if I look back at the questions that you asked, these are associations that formed so early on in life. In fact, when in the second series of connecting words, the minute you said black and chalk, the only thing that came to my mind was board. And very quickly, the memory was back when I was in school, which was several decades ago. So I think these associations are formed very early on in life. And once these associations are formed, the cognitive part of our brain is able to very quickly recall and build that association. So I don't even think that there was a thought process behind it.
So yeah, you were just merely exposed to the board in this case, right? So many times in your life that it was just effortless for you to even come up with it, right?
Yeah. And even the second set, right, where you said elephant, house, and snow. We always listen to the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
Yeah.
You know what a white elephant is. And of course, the White House is pretty ubiquitous given the amount of information that comes to us on it. So yeah, that was a fairly easy association as well. So in fact, with respect to your song, Jyothi, reminds me of something, I think that falls on the lines of something like a repeated stimulus, but we'll come to that later.
Okay. So we live in, times of information abundance, right? The amount of information that we consume or content we consume every day is so much that behavioral economists have termed us cognitively lazy, right? There is a term called cognitively lazy because all we do is just consume content without really giving it a second thought. And that's what leads us to make decisions in our judgments. We might make mistakes in our day-to-day decisions that we make. And that's because we rely on something called heuristics, right? That is mental shortcuts. And so these shortcuts more or less make us take wrong decisions. So what do you think makes us cognitively lazy?
Yeah, I think it also goes back to the association, right? Once you form those associations and they sit rather deeply, I think, and that's your own process of discovery also, because technically, I mean, a heuristic is a way of learning which allows you to discover something. And if we go back to the example of 3 words, the association of that single word with the 3 others is something that is so deeply formed. And like I mentioned earlier, it just gives you the wow feeling, and you feel so good that you were able to associate it in that way and get the right answer. That I think that's what makes us lazy or cognitively lazy.
Yeah, being at ease with, cognitive abilities, not really making an effort to think critically, I think is like our default human brain. That's the way of working, I guess.
Yeah. And I think it's becoming more and more ominous in today's world, simply because of what you said, Jyothi, the amount of information that's around us, we are bombarded. And I also think that, maybe we can talk about this in a later episode, is how do we deal with the information overload? But I think that is also largely contributing to the fact that the brain is defaulting to what it knows already, what it feels comfortable with, rather than exercising critical thinking and therefore making choices post that critical thinking.
Yeah.
So another term that I came across is says that we are cognitive misers. Or maybe the law of conservation of energy applies to what we really choose to think about or be discreet about, rather than taking the easy way out. So one thing that comes to my mind is when I was growing up in the mid 80s, through the mid 90s, we pretty much had only one television channel in this country. Right. But the nice part is all the ads that people saw. I mean, the entire country saw the same set of ads, and we had some really creative jingles come out in the day that all of us remember even today.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of association with the ad, the visualization, the songs, the product, So I think advertisement is also a good way of just repeating the same thing.
Yeah, I think washing powder Nirma is like the best.
Oh, yes. And yeah, there are a whole lot of them, like the Complan ad and the Bajaj lighting.
I think we
So
can
many
have a
of them.
separate episode on ads back in the day.
Yes, certainly. So, the one more thing that we wanted to talk about today, one of the effects of us being cognitively lazy or being miserly with using our better cognitive powers is manifesting a lot through what we commonly known as fake news, right? And an example of misinformation or fake news recently I came across, the Commonwealth Games recently concluded.
Mhm.
And during the Commonwealth Games, a very, very famous Indian athlete was participating in one of the athletic events. And suddenly that day, or rather after the event was conducted and the final was yet to be conducted, there was a video of hers that was circulating on WhatsApp saying that she had won the gold medal for that particular event. And for a while, I received that video through 3 or 4 messages, different messages. And in each one of the messages, people in the group were actually congratulating her on having won the medal. And then suddenly something struck me as odd about that video clip because it never said anything about the location or what the games were about. It was just a clip that showed her running in the last maybe 10 or 15 seconds of the event, where incidentally she did win a gold in that event, but it was not in the Commonwealth Games. It had happened a few years earlier. But I realized that I was so caught up in the excitement of India winning so many medals during these games that I thought that this had actually happened, that she had won the event, whereas the finals hadn't even taken place, So I mean, this is, I think, a good illustration of the illusory truth effect, or also what's commonly known as the illusion of truth. And that's the cognitive bias that we are talking about today. And it's how when we hear the same information that gets repeated again and again, we come to believe that that's true. And, even though we feel people should know better than to believe this kind of information, it happens, right? So in simple terms, people are more likely to believe something the more often it's repeated to them. Because with repetition, it's that much easier for the human mind to process a statement compared to other ideas or other visuals that are competing that have not been repeated again and again.
Yeah, I think this also reminds me of something called the mere exposure effect. By being exposed to a particular fact or information many number of times, you start processing it more easily, or keeping aside all your critical thinking hats, you just believe it more easily, right? Just because you're exposed to a particular piece of information more number of times.
Yes. And in fact, another example about fake information or misinformation and how people believed it was during the pandemic. Given that we knew very little about this virus, any and every little piece of information that was coming out during that time seemed to be going viral, with more and more people, cooped up or locked up inside their homes. It just made it, I think, that much easier for people to believe what they were receiving on what we sarcastically and popularly call WhatsApp University, to be able to believe something about this disease or the way it was working or what kind of effects it was having on people, to be the absolute source of truth, isn't it?
Yeah, repetition is like the key to just getting people to accept your message.
Yeah, it seems to be quite easy these days.
Especially with our varied platforms of social media that we have. So, one of the objectives of this podcast is to also show the importance of how this knowledge in, behavioral psychology or human behavior patterns is useful in the field of user experience, right? So, how do you think this illusory truth effect can play out in user research? Can user researchers can they be aware of this bias?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question and an important one, given that these 4 episodes that we're looking at are meant to help UX researchers. So one thing I can think of is let's take an example, and let's imagine a group of, let's say, 3 or 5 user experience researchers talking to a group of senior citizens about their online banking experience. Now we know that a good majority of senior citizens, at least in this country, are not very trusting of digital banking. Right? They're very used to having walked into a bank and getting their banking work done there. So these group of researchers is trying to find out what their pain points are. So how do you go about it? So one of the commonly used techniques in user experience research is to apply the 5 whys, where in a conversation with a potential user or a customer, and when you're trying to understand their empathize with them, and discover what their needs are, discover what their pain points are, you use the 5 whys to ask them questions with a why to try and see how far you can go with identifying what the problem is. So let's say you start by asking, what is it that they find difficult? And most people don't tell you that answer very directly. But let's say the first answer you get is, I find it hard to figure out where to log in on my banking portal. And let's say this is the response that everyone gets. And let's say as one UX researcher, you say, why is that? And maybe they come back with a response saying, I just can't find it. And let's say the 5 UX researchers get back together and they all come to the conclusion that senior citizens are finding it hard to locate where to log in on the bank portal. So one question is, how many of them actually went further, right, to find out why they found it difficult? Why do they think it's difficult to find out? And especially when these conversations are happening over the phone, it's harder to stay in the conversation or even visualize why this person is finding it hard to log in.
Right.
So you're more likely to come away with those first 2 answers rather than, going deep, making more of an effort or trying a different set of questions to get to what really is the problem. So as UX researchers, you might come back to the design team and say, oh, they're just finding it difficult to locate. But can you go further in that conversation? So in some sense, you have fallen in line with what we also call the fluency effect. Okay, so that's one instance where I can see it can impact user researchers, where it could prevent you from going a lot deeper into user research to really find out what the problems are.
Right. So how is a fluency effect kind of affecting the researchers here? Is it because it's easier to just provide online survey or a questionnaire with number of questions? You're saying it's easier for the user researchers to go that way than actually put a lot more effort in going deeper into figuring out why those answers were answered by the senior citizens, right?
So I think if people are hearing the same thing, right, enough of times, it's that you tend to believe that is, what it is.
Right. Okay. If there are a lot of users who've probably given the same type of answer and you see the same information again and again as a user researcher, you think, okay, the people are finding it difficult to find the login button and that's the problem. And so you just go and give it away to the design team. You are not really making an effort to understand why the login button is being difficult to be found out, right?
Yeah. No, and also I think it's about, so a lot of people are also, more likely to make a judgment or a decision based on their gut reaction, right? Or their first reaction that they receive. So this is more, this also falls in line with that. So it feels like it's fluent, right? The response that they're getting from the customers feels like it's fluent.
That's what makes the processing easier.
Yeah. So in fact, in UX research, there's a method of heuristic evaluation. But in like you said earlier, a heuristic is actually another way of saying a mental shortcut.
Right.
And I think it's because there are so many decisions that probably somebody has to make, rather than thinking of all the pros and cons, or in this case, trying to explore other ways of getting to really what the problem is, we tend to feel that our minds are getting overloaded. And so we default to making a decision based on what we are first hearing.
So, in this case, do you think having a third party conduct a UX audit for a particular product can be more beneficial to avoid, say, common pitfalls?
That's definitely one way of looking at it. In fact, but there again, right, if you, let's say, this is based on a recent experience of a UX audit that we did for a company that was offering cloud solutions. And we went in as the UX audit team, and I noticed something, right? Initially, when we were given a sandbox to play around and figure out the workflows in the system without, let's say, being biased by the internal engineer's view of how this whole system could be provisioned and configured, we saw a lot of gaps in the workflows, in the ease of configuration, in the ease of provisioning, the look and feel, the navigability, the interaction with the system, and so on. And we were able to come up with a lot of points, right, or suggestions of how things could be improved. Whereas, as we started to have more conversations with the team inside, I began to notice that they had got used to configuring and provisioning certain workflows in a particular way. So it was hard for them to see how it would be difficult for an external person to configure the system. And therefore, see, heuristics are also indicators that are used to make quick judgments. So in this case, they were, rather than conducting a very complex analysis, and in this case, once you've already built the system, you have customers using it, you are not able to step away from that system and look at it objectively to see how workflows can be improved, how you can make things simpler and easier for your customers, becomes a little difficult, because every time your earlier association is coming into play. Okay. And especially in the system that we were looking at, the complexity was driven by the environment, by the number of configuration parameters, by the number of roles that people would be playing in the system, the accessibility, security, so many dimensions. So to your question, Jyothi, yes, conducting a third-party UX audit can be beneficial, but it's also important to keep that objectivity throughout the course of the project. So I think one of the things that people can do is definitely have an open mind and become aware of the fact that, like, at one point in time during this project, I was asking myself, I think I've got very used to this workflow, so I'm not able to see what the alternative could look like.
Yeah.
If there was a better way of doing something. So I think being mindful of that all the time would certainly be helpful to a team that's doing a UX audit. So how is it that UX researchers can avoid the illusory truth effect and falling into the trap of fluency? So I would say two things is definitely knowing about these biases can be helpful, just being aware of them. The second point being that when in UX research or in user experience design, always try to take a step back and not come under the influence of something becoming very fluent. So which also calls for a lot of vigilance, I would say, on the individual's part to see if, why is my mind always going in this direction? So when you find yourself doing that, pause, take a step back and say, okay, let me start again, or probably step away from it, or find somebody to whom you can explain this, preferably somebody who knows nothing about it. Say, illustrate with an example and say, hey, if you had to do this and this is how you had to navigate it, does this make sense? Okay, so try to bounce it off of another person. And at the same time, I think getting familiar with what these biases are is also very helpful.
Just being aware of this kind of a human behavior pattern exists itself, goes a long way, at least for me. In the past few weeks of researching for this podcast itself is making me aware of the way that I make decisions are all just mental shortcuts that I take. Right?
Yeah, and I can empathize with that situation, because today I think a couple of things here as well, right? We are flooded with so much information and we're constantly having to take decisions. So it definitely gets tiring. And the second thing is we all also seem to be rushing through the day. I would like to say, try and just do one thing at a time. That whole thing of our mind launching multiple threads at any given point in time, it also renders you inefficient. So you'd rather spend time with one thing, focus only on that one thing, and then I think you'll be able to observe it critically. In fact, somewhere I read that some of the best scientists or analytical minds, often when you look at their faces, they look very grumpy or very serious. You rarely see them smiling. But I've always felt it's not anything to do with poor social skills, but a lot more to do with the effort on their part. And they've chosen to do that, to be more vigilant and think critically all the time.
It drains out more cognitive resources being vigilant, right? Rather than just acting fast and thinking automatically and not really working with awareness.
That's true. Going with the flow seems to be the easier thing to do, isn't it?
Yeah, that's like your mantra. Go with the flow.
I know. And actually, you brought out a very interesting thing, which is I think this also plays in having the courage to, stand apart and look at things objectively rather than just going with the first thing that you hear or see. Try to look at it critically. And I think for a person in, especially in user experience design, that's very important. Right? Just because a workflow was designed in a particular way doesn't mean that it's the right way. There's always scope for improvement, and especially for user experience people, right? Keeping the customer front and center of everything that they do is important, because at the end of the day, you are designing or building something to address the needs or solve the problems of that customer. So I think these points, when kept in mind, will help user experience researchers and designers not fall into the trap of these biases.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to show the importance of how all these supposedly boring researches, maybe gathering dust in the libraries, are actually not as boring. They can be so helpful, at least in the present day of software development or creating products. These behavioral psychology and study of human behavior patterns are becoming more and more important in our field as UX researchers or UX designers, right? So thanks a lot, Chitra. This was a great episode of another cognitive bias, the illusory truth effect. And stay tuned to the Aedge podcast. We will be back with another episode of studying a new bias next week. Until then, focus on being more rational.
Well, that is something easier said than done, Jyothi. But thank you so much. I've enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you, Chitra.
Please subscribe to the Aedge podcast on your favorite podcast channel. We are on Google, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and more. If you liked this episode, please share it with your friends. If you have stories to share and want to be featured on our podcast, write to us at podcasts@adepticlabs.com.